do have a brief message this evening as well. And I've been looking at this theme of hope, which just seemed to be a very timely theme to look at. And so on Palm Sunday, from John 12 through 19, we talked about raising hope. And then last night, from Matthew 26:17 through 30, we talked about instituting hope. And then tonight, this evening, from Isaiah 52 and 53, the verses we read, I want to talk about the despairing hope, the despairing hope. And so this evening, as we consider this, it is Good Friday. And Good Friday, the themes of Good Friday are dark. They're certainly a more subdued and solemn mood in which we celebrate. And so with this theme and these topics, we recognize that as we come to the scriptures and we look at this despairing hope, we can see why there is a despair of hope this evening. First, the prophet Isaiah. He said, "For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him." In Isaiah 53:2. The intention of this verse is more simple than you might think. It's to say that Jesus, in his humanity, was normal. Jesus was normal in the eyes of the people. He grew up just like anyone else, just like any other Jewish young male at that time. He grew up like them. To put it a little bit in our terminology, in his Jewish high school, he was probably voted the most likely to be mundane and ordinary, not really to accomplish much of anything. When you think about, okay, hypothetically in our imaginations, his high school career, Jesus wasn't the most outstanding. He wasn't the star quarterback of the football team in his Jewish high school. He wasn't the star power forward of the basketball team in his high school. He probably wasn't a respected intellectual student either. He wasn't in the National Honor Society, or a master chess player, or a scientist. He probably didn't win the county science fair or anything like that. Jesus was just very normal. And frankly, most of us can relate to that because most of us are pretty normal people. We've had pretty much normal lives with the ordinariness that goes with that. Sure, we have skills, we have abilities, we have talents. I'm sure that each of us do in our own ways. But really, we're probably not, any of us, considered overly outstanding by this world. And yet it's amazing so often how God uses very normal, ordinary people for extraordinary purposes. And here we know that he does that with Jesus in his humanity. The second thing we see from the prophet Isaiah, he tells us this: his appearance was marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind. He says in Isaiah 52:14. This is gruesome. This is a type of language that shows the beating and the cruelty of the Roman soldiers and the beating that Jesus would receive. Isaiah describes Jesus, the Son of God, the Messiah, as beaten and bruised and disfigured. And with a description like this, we can kind of feel and sense the despair of that situation. The Messiah, the Savior, is beaten beyond recognition. And when we think about this, the one who came to save us cannot even save himself. Imagine what the disciples felt at this point in time as they see this. Now, of course, I mean, some of the disciples, Peter specifically, he was ready to fight. He was ready to fight the Romans, the Jewish authorities, whoever it took. Peter draws his sword and he slices off the ear of the high priest's servant. And he was saying, we're here to fight for you, Jesus. And yet Jesus told him, put away your sword, Peter. The one who lives by the sword will die by the sword. The person they thought was the Messiah is mercilessly beaten. And it's challenging, isn't it? How often do we put our trust and our hope in people? We think they're the one who will make everything right in the world, and they're going to fix it all for us. And hey, they're taking care of everything. And we think that. Now, when we think that about Jesus, just imagine this night where Jesus is arrested, where Jesus is condemned and beaten. And the disciples, they've placed all their hope in him. They're ready to fight for him and go to the death for him. And yet, he says no, and he experiences this. And in experiencing this, their hope is shattered. Third, Isaiah tells us, he said, we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. And they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death. Jesus Christ was considered stricken and smitten by God. In other words, people thought it was because of his own sin that God allowed him to be punished like this in such a horrible fashion. I mean, we saw it in his suffering as he's hanging upon the cross, the mocking that occurred. If you are the Christ, come down from the cross. And there was all kind of other mocking that would occur during this time. And so Jesus, he remains silent, even when he's being tried by the Jewish leaders and later by Pilate. He keeps his mouth closed. I mean, it's hard to believe that he didn't defend himself in these situations, because any of us probably would have been arguing our case and defending ourselves, and yet Jesus remains silent. He died, and in his death, he dies between two criminals, probably two men who were leading a rebellion against Rome. He dies between these two criminals. And then when he dies, his body is taken and put in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, a rich man. And this was all predicted. It was predicted way back in Isaiah, and we see it there. Now, one thought that comes to me as I was reading this is, how often do we think that someone is stricken by God? What about the person, their fortunes change and they experience a job loss or a disease or a failed marriage or problems with their kids, and other Christians are standing around thinking, oh, well, what did they do to deserve this? And they're automatically blaming them and thinking they did something and God is somehow judging them. And that's where Jesus, in identifying with his suffering, is so important. Jesus was sinless. He was perfect. He perfectly kept the law of God. He did nothing wrong except be who he was as the Messiah. And he's crucified. And we know that, folks, just because something goes wrong in our life doesn't mean that we somehow offended God. We somehow displeased God. And yet things in life, they do go wrong. They do go in a direction that we wish they wouldn't. And yet when that happens, I hope that helps us to relate to Jesus more deeply, because he too experienced that. At this point, we see the despair of hope. The prophet Isaiah, he describes for us what happens to Jesus Christ before it actually occurred in history. With his death, their hope died as well. In Lutheran theology, We call this the theology of the cross. The theology of the cross. Jesus Christ was fully God and fully man, and yet in his flesh, he came as nothing extraordinary. Jesus was normal. He suffered by being beaten and ultimately crucified. And yet, through the cross, he won the victory. See, that turns everything on its head. He won the victory by suffering and dying. In our earthly mindset, that's not victory, that's defeat. And yet, the gospel says, no, that's victory. That's what real victory is like, is that when we suffer, and when we suffer with Jesus Christ, that's when the real victory is won. And so it does turn everything on its head. See, King Jesus was born in a stable, not in a palace. King Jesus' birth was announced by shepherds, not royal messengers. King Jesus' work was as a carpenter, not a ruler, although he may use the ruler. King Jesus' death was as a criminal, not as a king. When Jesus came, born into the manger, when he suffered, experiencing opposition and rejection, when Jesus died upon the cross, he did it all for us. And that's where the hint of hope. See, if we just stopped where we're at now, have we truly experienced the hope or just the despair? But in the midst of despair, in the midst of the cross, we find hope, because Isaiah informs us, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He did it all for us. He did it all for us. He had no sin of his own to die for, no transgressions, no iniquities. And yet ours was laid on him. It was laid on him. In Hebrews 4:15 it says this: we have a high priest who is tempted in every point like we are, yet without sin. It was all for us. It was not for himself. Paul says God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God, in 2 Corinthians 5:21. Jesus had no sin of his own to atone for. So what does he do? He atones for our sin. In Isaiah 53:8, we find that his generation did not understand what was happening to him. They didn't understand it. And folks, we don't always understand what is happening either. Sometimes we're confused about how God is working and what God is doing. And in that confusion is challenging, because in our confusion, do we still follow him? Do we still look to him? I know it's challenging when we feel that confusion and we're wondering what God is up to and how is he working. And as we wonder that, if we're not careful, we can get off the path and stop following him because of the confusion we feel. His disciples didn't always understand. They expected a political Messiah who would come in, take over, kick the Romans out, set up a nation of Israel that was independent and free, and that's not what happened. No, the Messiah came and he died upon the cross. Jesus told them, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me, in Luke 9:23. Again, Jesus says, whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. The spiritual life involves suffering. Spiritual life involves defeat. The spiritual life isn't built on our strength, but on our weakness. The spiritual life means we may experience rejection and even oppression. But remember, our crosses are connected to Jesus. They're connected to him. And we identify with him through our suffering and the theology of the cross. Crosses are not chosen by us, but allowed by God in our lives. Crosses that are chosen can be rejected and put aside, but the crosses that Jesus is talking about here are the ones like his that we can't choose to take it or leave it. We have to accept it. In other words, life happens. Life happens. We face difficulties and trials. But know this, that Jesus Christ faced them before us and he faces them with us. Also, we find that we are dependent, weak, insufficient, unable, and sometimes even unstable. We need Jesus. We need to rely on him. And I hope and pray that we do rely on Jesus and we embrace our weakness. And so this evening, may we look to and cling to the suffering servant, Jesus Christ, who suffered, bled, and died for us. Amen.